As you're logging in and you're testing your audio, please let me know, type in the chat if you're having any issues seeing or hearing anything. Okay, I'll be monitoring the group chat. So I think we'll get started. Thanks, Emily, for the thumbs up, the all good. Yep, I have a message that we can see your screen, and yes, that is green. Okay, so I'll start the introductions while Cliff is preparing to start. So we have Cliff Jones. He is a consulting partner at Capacity Building Partnerships. He is an organizational development consultant and a human rights activist with over 30 years of experience in working in nonprofit, government, labor, and for-profit organizational development. He has experience as a frontline staff, supervisor, project manager, and executive director. He has been working in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion for over 30 years. He was a staff consultant with the Nonprofit Association of Oregon for 25 years. Cliff's also served on boards of the MRG Foundation, Funding Exchange Foundation, Oregon Minority AIDS Coalition, Multnomah Legal Service Workers Union, and Peer Counseling Community. He's been a trainer for the Black Leadership and Community Development Institute and is a recipient of Nordstrom's Cultural Diversity Community Service Award. So we're really fortunate to have Cliff share his expertise with us today. I met Cliff through Maria Lisa Johnson, who is one of his business partners, and she's actually done some work with Xenium internally to help us with our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative. So they're great partners, and you know, we're happy to have them share their expertise and be a resource for us and our clients. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Cliff.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Happy that we can meet over the internet. And thanks for that introduction, Susie. Zoom communication. Okay. Just a little background noise.
Yes, please make sure that you mute yourself. You do not unmute yourself.
So I actually think everyone accidentally got unmuted. So if you could remute yourself. So welcome. I just want to tell you a little bit more about myself. We want to learn a little bit about you via poll, and then we'll jump right in. So as Susie said, I worked for the Nonprofit Association of Oregon for 25 years, and then a year and a half ago, when they closed their consulting program, we started a small firm called Capacity Building Partnerships and continued the work. I came to the Nonprofit Association of Oregon in the early 90s after a tragic incident in Southeast Portland. Mulugeta Sarah was an Ethiopian student living and going to school in Portland and was brutally murdered by skinheads in Southeast Portland. And the neighborhood was shocked that a racist motivated incident happened in their environment. And so we got a grant from the city of Portland and began working with community groups, faith organizations, nonprofits, businesses, anyone who would meet with us to help them respond. And what came out of that was the desire to create an environment that's unwelcoming of racism. And so the neighborhood did tons of things, a couple of which, one are they started this campaign for businesses and organizations to put signs up in their window that said, oppressive behavior is not welcome. And we also had a leaders group, and we had 3 leaders groups of up to 75 people in each group that met for 3 weeks in a row to build leadership in the community around creating an inclusive environment. So that was the start of my work with Kathleen Herron and Guadalupe Guajardo in a project called Tools for Diversity. After that, after we continued that work at Nonprofit Association of Oregon and actually started the Equity and Inclusion Leaders Network there, which I think is in its 25th year this year. So I've done a lot of training and consulting and work in the community myself, sort of individual development. This work is an ongoing process, it's lifelong. So I'm happy to be here with you, and we'll see what we can do over this electronic medium. I'd like to, I have 4 questions, and I'd like you to respond in the chat. The first question is, what is your experience with Zoom? Put a 1 in the chat if you're new to it. Put a 2 in the chat if it's sort of intermediate, if you're intermediate use, and 3 if you're long-term. So let's see. And Susie, could you share? I actually,
Yeah, I could share what I see here. So it looks like we have a fair amount of 1s. So I would say most people are 1s or 2s. And then there are just, gosh, really just like 2 3s.
Okay. So we're sort of, a lot of us are new at this. So if you have any problems with it, send Susie a chat and she'll let us know. Does everyone know how to use the chat? I hope so. No, I'm seeing some people don't know how to use the chat. Susie, could you explain how to use the chat?
Yes, so on the bottom of your screen, towards the bottom of your screen, you should see a toolbar. And there is an icon that looks like a little communication bubble, and it says chat. And if you click on that, then it should open a chat window, and you'll see where you can type a message in the window. I'm typing one now. And then you just essentially hit enter after you type your message, and it goes out.
So look for the chat symbol, open it up, play with it. Try and send Susie a chat if you have not been able to do so yet. The second sort of check-in question is, how are you doing with the COVID-19 pandemic? Text 1 if you're not doing very well. Text 2 if sort of okay. And 3 if you're good, you're doing fine. So 1, not well, 2, okay, 3, doing pretty good.
Yeah, mostly 2s and 3s. Lots of 3s. That's good.
Good, good. Well, I'm glad folks are doing well. I actually just want to take 30 seconds of silence. I actually got a call this morning that a friend had died, and I think all of us are being impacted in many ways. So I'd just like to take 30 seconds for us to just notice the times that we're in and to send well wishes to everyone. Thank you. And then the two more questions about diversity, equity, and inclusion. One is, what is your individual diversity, equity, and inclusion experience? Put in 1 if it's new, 2 if it's intermediate, 3 if it's long term.
Okay, we have a mix here.
Mm-hmm.
Quite a variety of results. So it looks like the majority is 2.
Okay.
So kind of right in the middle there.
Okay. So many of us sort of at the beginning, a critical mass in the middle have been involved in some way, and it sounds like there's a few people that have a lot of experience. Then the last poll question is, what is your organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion experience? Again, the same thing. 1 if it's new, 2 if it's intermediate, 3 if it's long term.
Okay. It looks like people are fairly early on in their work and their organizations. So a lot of 1s, some 2s, and then I think we have like maybe 2 3s.
Okay. So a lot of folks organizationally new to this work, and it sounds like people have a little more experience than their organizations do. So thanks for participating in that. Next thing I want to do is just go over some of the group Zoom protocols, and we actually just did some practice. So we have the ability to do polls. We just did 4. We'd like you to use the chat to share your questions and comments, and Susie will monitor and manage that. So it's really important for you to participate, to use the chat. If anyone has not been able to figure out how to use the chat, please unmute yourself so that we can talk you through it, because we want you to be able to participate. So if there's anyone that has not been able to figure out how to use the chat, please unmute yourself and tell us what the challenge is, and we'll talk you through it.
Okay, I can't figure it out.
Okay. Are you on a computer or a iPhone or iPad? Or
iPad. I see a little box down in the right-hand corner.
Uh-huh.
It's got a bunch of small writing on it.
Mm-hmm.
But when I tap on that, it doesn't do anything.
Okay.
Okay. Do you see a window that says 2 and then type message here?
No.
Okay. And then what about a chat icon?
No, I don't see any. When I open it up, it's got Xenium Workshop Zoom Tech Outline, navigating your next steps.
Yeah, that's Cliff's screen. So you're seeing Cliff's screen.
Oh.
On the bottom, do you see where it says mute, start video?
Yeah, that's across the top for me. I've got mute.
Oh, it's on the top. Okay, good.
Participants.
You don't see anything on that top toolbar that says chat?
No. Oh, when I get more. Okay, I see it now, chat.
Yep, so click on that and it should open a window that will allow you to type a message.
Okay, I see that now.
Great. And that was helpful because you're not seeing what I thought you were seeing.
Yeah, mine's on the bottom.
What are you all seeing on the shared screen, Susie?
What I see on my screen is your outline, because
Okay.
you're sharing your screen, and I have your face.
Okay, that's not what I thought you were seeing. So let me take a moment to get you back to the right screen. so I'm gonna stop sharing screen and I'm gonna start sharing screen again, and I'm gonna try and get you on. Oh. Here's screen 2. I think this is the right screen. What are you seeing now?
Your slide.
The breakout Zoom protocols?
Yep.
Okay. So whoever that was who was having the problem, thank you, because I thought you all were seeing this screen and you were seeing the outline. So we might have some of those faux pas. If you ever are not seeing the PowerPoint screen, someone let me know. So it sounds like we have everyone able to use chats, document share, so you can control the size of the document to see on the screen. On my computer, you can move the window that has the little boxes of everyone, that you can move that around, you can enlarge it, or you can make it smaller. So that's something that you can play with and have some control over. We will have breakout rooms. We'll probably do 3. And what those are you will be put in groups of 2 or 3 in a breakout room. Susie will manage that. You'll randomly be put in small groups. I will give you discussion questions, and when the time is up, you'll receive a message in the room that says you have a minute left, and then you will be put back into the large room. In order to get into the breakout room, you will have to click join. So you will get a message on your screen that says join the breakout room. You will have to click on that, and that will put you in a breakout room with a small group. In those groups, make sure everyone gets a chance to speak. And I will tell you how much time you have in the groups before you go in. So just make sure everyone gets a chance to speak. And please listen well to each other. It's an opportunity to practice listening skills, which are really critical to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Please stay muted. We'll mostly share through chats, but if you're having a challenge or you're not being heard, unmute yourself and let us know what the challenge is. I really appreciate the person who unmuted and said that they weren't able to use the chat. We want everyone to be able to participate, so let us know if you're not able to. If you have questions, please type them in the chat, and then Susie will jump in with questions. So Susie, when you get questions and when you have questions and there's an opening, please raise them. For some reason, I don't have access to chats in this version, so I won't be able to see them. And then the last thing is, please set up a place to write down notes to take into breakout room discussions. So I will tell you what the questions are. You'll see them on the screen. Just keep notes so that when you're in those discussions, you can have that as a context. So that is the Zoom protocol in practice. Any feedback through chats about that, Susie?
I don't see anything. So
great.
I'll assume that's good for now.
All right, so we're going to go to review the agenda. So you should see on your screen the 3 areas of focus for our time this morning. The first area is diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're going to review the definitions. As we do that, I'd like you to jot down insights, reactions, and questions. And then we'll go into small groups and I'll ask you what resonates and what questions you have about the intent of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So really specific focus in our culture, in organizations, around increasing diversity and equity and inclusion. So what do those mean? There's a lot of ways to think about them. In all that we do today or this morning, I'm not trying to get you to think a certain way or to think like I do. What the focus is for you to develop your own critical thinking and analysis. So as you look at various ways to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, what makes sense to you, what works in your context. And organizationally, it's useful for folks to be on the same page about what those definitions mean. The second area of focus is this capacity building framework and organizational assessment. So the capacity building framework is a way to have a mental model. We think diversity, equity, and inclusion work should be integrated into the work of the organization and should be lifelong, both for individuals and for organizations. This is not sort of a drive-by. Let's do a training. Let's take a year to focus on this. We think that that diversity, equity, and inclusion are values and principles that, if integrated fully into your organization, will increase your capacity to achieve your mission and vision. Whether you're for-profit, nonprofit, government, or union, or labor, that the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion help us to be more effective at our vision and goals. So we'll look at that that framework, and I'll ask you to do a sort of a hands-on organizational assessment. Again, I'll ask you to share some of what you come up with in another breakout room. It'll probably be different people because they're randomly assigned. And then the last area of focus, which we'll get at towards the end of the morning, is strategically investing your diversity, equity, and inclusion time, energy, and resources. So there are hundreds, thousands of things to do. How do you identify what is strategic based on your organization, based on the type of organization you are, based on the type of industry you're in? What are the things that, if invested in, will build capacity and build organizational effectiveness and increase your capacity to achieve your vision and mission and goals? So I'd like you to walk out with some ideas of next steps, where to invest your time, energy, and resources. So those are the three areas that we'll focus on this morning, and we'll take a couple of breaks in between the topics. So if anyone has any questions, please put them in a chat. And Susie will let me know when you have some questions. So we're going to jump right into diversity, equity, and inclusion. So just take a look at those images. Diversity is regarding are we a monoculture or are we a multicultural organization? So diversity is about the diversity in cultural identities that are present, diversity in the ways of being, in our capacity to notice and understand and honor those differences. Inclusion is focused on who is at the decision-making table, both for the large decisions made organizationally and the decisions made at the team level and day to day. And do people feel empowered to have a voice? Is their worldview and experience listened to? Is there data happening that some people in the organization know that, if included in planning, decision-making, evaluation, and analysis, would actually make us a more effective organization, but they are excluded? There's no place for them to have input. There's no place for them to have standing. What is the impact of that exclusion on their experience in the organization, on their morale and motivation? And are dollars going out the door because we are not being inclusive, but we're being exclusive? Both dollars in terms of productivity and in terms of data that could help us be a more effective organization. Equity is about how people are differently situated. Every system is built with some identity group in mind. And the identity group for whom that system is built is advantaged because it is built based on their needs. And the identity groups that that's not built for are disadvantaged. So just the design of how we do work, the design of our cultural values, which we may assume are true for everyone, can situate people differently. We may have policies that are based on cultural values that advantage some people and disadvantage others. Those may be policies based on, for instance, religious holidays and religious observations, and the ways that we may be organized around that advantage some people and disadvantage others. Tons of ways that the assumptions that we make about standards that may be used to exclude people, or that some people may be advantaged by them. So equity, and for many of us, equity is viewed as the same. So if I do the same for everyone, that's equitable. And what we know is if you do the same for everyone, some people will be advantaged and some people will be disadvantaged. So if you're interested in equity, it actually is very complex because it means we have to do things in different ways to meet the different needs of people. So I'll stop there before we go on to...
Please mute yourself. Thank you. Actually, Cliff, I have a question, if you don't mind, about what you were just talking about. I love the way you described equity. I thought that was really interesting about the design of an organization or policies being built around the identity of a certain group.
Mm-hmm.
The question I have is, these are three different things.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot involved in each of these three areas. So do you recommend that organizations try and focus on all three, or one at a time, or what's reasonable?
I think it depends on where you are. So if you're an organization that has sort of a monoculture, and by that I mean that, the people, the employees or the people that you serve are pretty similar, then you might need to start with diversity. But before, one thing that we see is that organizations often diversify and think, okay, we're done. And what's really helpful before you diversify is to think about the organizational environment that you're in. And is that going to be welcoming? Because one thing that we see in organizations that start with diversity and don't think about the environment of the organization as a revolving door. People come and go, come and go, come and go. And then there gets to be a narrative about the organization. And it becomes harder to attract the diversity in their ranks and in their services. So I'm working with an organization now in which the board is really wanting to diversify, and they actually have 2 new people coming on the board, and they're doing a lot of work around creating a welcoming environment. I was recently in a meeting, and it was a Zoom call, and we just launched right into the work. We just launched. No one hardly said hi, and after about 3 minutes, I just stopped and I said, "So we really, a lot of the people who you are reaching out to are more relational and less transactional." The chair acknowledged that the person was, that they were very transactional. And transactional means I get right to business. It doesn't matter who you are. I don't care how your day is. We have business to get done. Time is money. And relational is we're not going to do business until we connect personally. And I have a colleague that told me a story. She's a white woman. She was interviewing for some work with a Black woman who was a part of a large institution. They started the meeting. It was an hour meeting, and this my white colleagues, the Black woman who was interviewing her and meeting with her, started asking her about her family, where she grew up, and this went on for a half an hour. At half an hour, my colleague was starting to sweat because she's like, I thought we were here to talk about this piece of work. It's not happening, but she knew enough to go with the flow. They talked about their lives for another 15 minutes. So 45 minutes into the meeting, they had not talked about the scope of work that was the point of the meeting. At 45 minutes, the woman who was interviewing her shifted the conversation to the scope of work. They got it done like that. And so in relational cultures, you build relationships and you work more effectively because of the relationship that you've built. So that's an example of how we need to be thoughtful organizationally. Just because we get a lot of diversity does not mean that things are going to go well. So I hope that helps with that question. One of the last things I want to do this morning is have you think about what's strategic. So I'm going to put up on the screen definitions for diversity, then inclusion, then equity. We'll leave them up for about a minute. I'd like you to take notes for anything that stands out for you. Insights, reactions, questions that come up. After we view the definitions of equity, I'm going to ask you to, we're going to go into small group discussions in breakout rooms. And we'll be in breakout rooms of 3 people. Depending on the numbers, there may be 4 people in some rooms. And then you'll be in those rooms for about actually 12 minutes. And after 12 minutes, we'll come back to the larger room and do a short check-in through chat. So if you don't have anything to write with, either something on the screen that you can type into or something that you can write down with on a piece of paper, please get that. Someone is unmuted and we're getting the noise, background noise. If you're muted, please mute. Thank you. So, so again, we're going to review the definitions. I'd like you to jot down insights, reactions, and questions. We'll then put you in small discussion groups in breakout rooms. You'll be in there with a couple other people. When you're in the room, everyone take a turn to share insights, questions, and reactions. And this is an opportunity. This is not a debate about who's right and who's wrong. This is a both and. So you're there to listen. And someone may have a perspective that is completely different than yours. And so I don't want you to say, oh, you're wrong about that. This is what's correct. I'd like you to just listen and notice it's a different perspective. This is an opportunity to practice holding difference, which is one of the skills around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So please bring to those small breakout rooms great listening and sharing your perspective. and your truth may be different than someone else's truth, and that's just fine. There's plenty of space in these breakout rooms for differing perspectives. So listen well, share your truth, acknowledge differences if you want. Make sure everyone gets a chance to speak. So someone might just be tracking time. And then you'll get a note in your breakout room that says it's wrapping up in a minute, and then you'll be brought back into the main room. If anyone has any challenge, you can, actually when you're in the breakout rooms, you won't be able to get out of them until the time is up. So if you have any, we'll check in for questions before we go in. But now we're going to review the 3 definitions. So take a moment and look at this definition of diversity, and just jot down any notes, insights, questions, reactions. So this is describing that diversity refers to the ways that we're different, and there are tons of ways that we're different. Differences are often they're attached to culture, and they're attached to individual differences. So we're both culturally specific and individually specific. And diversity is about the mix of those differences. One of the tenets and one of the business cases for diversity, equity, and inclusion is that if we don't have all the voices in the room, we don't have the best information. I do some work with large corporations, and one of our, the company that I do that work had a contract with NASA. And in some of the NASA equipment failures, the people were in the room that had the information, but the chain of command did not give them voice. So the data was in the room, but people were not able to offer it in a credible way. And so, so diversity is getting people in the room. Just because people are there doesn't mean they will be included. So diversity is important, but it's not enough. So, yes. Was there a comment or question?
There's a comment from a earlier conversation about online mediums like these are much more difficult for relational types.
Exactly.
And there was some agreement with that.
Thank you for,
So yes.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. We're trying to make it more relational by, you'll be in breakout rooms 3 times. That's sort of the best that we can do. But thank you for raising that. That is true. And so it advantages people that just sort of want to get down to business, that maybe maybe a little more introverted. And for someone who's extroverted and has to talk and engage, then this can be challenging. So thanks for raising that. And if we could be together, we would. Inclusion, take a moment and reflect on that definition. So inclusion moves to, once we have diversity, do we have structures, systems, and processes that allow people to speak authentically? I was working with an organization earlier this week in which there is sort of denial at the leadership level that, well, it's an organization of about 60 people, and the executive leadership is white. A good part of the staff are people of color, and people of color feel like they don't have voice, they can't talk about their experience, that they're not heard, and when they do, they're retaliated against. And the white leadership does not believe that's true. And so people do not speak authentically. And we worked with this organization several times, and we got to a point where people started speaking authentically. And the leadership said we should have shut that down, that we want to have things be comfortable. And so a part of the challenge of inclusion, and one of the things that we say is in this work, get comfortable being uncomfortable. That discomfort actually is not a bad thing. That our comfort zone is what we know, and inclusion may require us to step outside of our comfort zone. So are you willing to give up your comfort to have a more inclusive process, to maybe have some of your values and beliefs challenged? So what are your insights, questions, and reactions to this concept of inclusion? How does it relate to you? How does it relate to your organization? Jot down some notes about that. And this doesn't mean that everything becomes democratic. You know, most organizations are hierarchical and decisions happen at different levels. So this doesn't mean everyone needs to be involved in everything. But it does mean that people need a place to be able to share their experience and insight and be heard and be respected and be validated. Any comments or questions about that so far? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to equity, which is the last one of these three. And I talked about that a little. And equity looks at how systems advantage people based on social identity group membership, like race, ethnicity, and gender. One thing that comes to mind for me that just is flashing in my mind is a couple years ago, I was working with a corporation on the East Coast. We had done a lot of work with this organization. They'd made a big commitment to equity and inclusion. And in this particular meeting, it was a 3.5-day workshop. There were several senior women leaders. And there was an old boys club that sort of ran this organization. And every year they had an annual gathering at some site, and they did company meetings, and people would get to know each other and socialize. And there were 4 senior women in the room in the company who had been there for like 25 to 30 years. And in the course of this meeting, all of them talked about an experience of sexual harassment at that conference, like someone they reported to knocking on their door at midnight. And none of them knew that the other ones had experienced that. These were tough women and they survived despite that. But the point is, they didn't even know what one another had to go through to navigate staying in that system with someone who had sexually harassed them, who was a superior, who had power in the organization. So they've been there 25 to 30 years and never talked to another person in the organization about that experience, and never imagined that all the senior women in the organization had gone through that. So equity is when that burden is not placed on people, that people can just bring their full selves and can participate and engage. How do we create environments that are equitable? What is the advantage in an environment if you don't have to deal with sexual harassment? If you don't have to navigate a superior who may be protecting themselves because you either did or didn't follow through with a sexual advance? Is there any comment or question? Okay. So back to these visual images of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And so now we're going to get ready to go into small group discussions in breakout rooms. And the question is, and please write this down, what resonates and what questions do you have about the intent of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Please start there. and then go to whatever else comes up. So have a fun discussion. When you get in the room, please introduce yourself. This is confidential. So you should not feel free to share what other people in your small discussion share. Only talk about your experience. When we come back, we'll have a little time for insights, reactions, and questions. And in that time, I don't want you to say, well, what so-and-so said, I think everyone needs to know. Let people decide what they want to self-disclose. Talk about what's relevant to you. Talk about what you said. Any questions about the small group discussions and breakout rooms, please put it in the chat. And I'll wait a moment for Susie to see if we have any questions. And if you have a question, please ask it, because it means that someone else also has a question.
Okay.
No questions, Susie?
I don't see any. So I'm gonna launch this. Cliff, you're gonna be in one of the rooms.
Okay. Okay.
If you don't
So
mind.
what I will do is I will not participate, but there's probably no way to do it without putting me in one of the rooms.
Yeah.
Can you put you and I in a room together?
I don't know if I can get into a room.
Okay.
So-
Okay. So you'll have 10 minutes. We'll come back to the main room at 9:30. We'll do some feedback and then we'll take a short break.
Yep, and I'll monitor the time.
Great. Have fun.
Hmm.
Hey, Renee.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I was just going to listen in because I had a conflicting meeting. Is that possible to do or?
Yep, totally. I just wanted to let you know they're in breakout rooms right now. So it's going to be quiet
Okay.
for like the next couple minutes.
Okay. Yeah,
I
I'll
didn't
just
want you
be
to wonder. Okay.
Carly's on. Sorry, I was just going to try to silently at least listen
Yep, that's
to
totally
my
fine.
meetings.
Yep. Okay.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure.
Welcome back.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's nice to chat with you, Colleen, and I'm not sure if we'll be in the same group again, but it was nice to meet you.
You too.
Colleen.
I think everybody should be back to the large group.
Great. Welcome back. So I found my chat box while you were in your small groups. So I'd love to hear from a few people, insights, reactions, questions to the concepts and definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Insights, reactions, questions. Sounds like some of you had some good chats.
I'm seeing great to meet you. I think people enjoy connecting with other people. Thank you for sharing. I think people appreciated hearing others' insights. Anna commented, resonate with how joyful it feels to find the connection points with someone in just 10 minutes.
Great.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly you can build rapport too in just a short amount of time.
Yeah, one thing I would say about that is important, that we often work with people who have worked together for years, and we put them in some structured, safe conversations, and they begin to share things with one another that they never knew. Oftentimes they find things that they have in common. And so it is really critically important to talk about these issues. And for most of us, we've been in some difficult conversations or things that went south. So many of us just sort of play it safe. So one of the things that you can do organizationally is structure safe conversations for people to talk about what's going on. And one thing we do is just help people connect and bring their cultural identity to work. Because if I'm checking 50% of who I am at the door when I come to work, because it's not an environment that's welcoming or that's inclusive or that I may feel safe in, then 50% of my life experience and knowledge is not going to whatever I'm doing in the organization. So creating an inclusive and welcoming environment means that people can bring more of themselves in the door when they come to work. And what they bring may be things that are really crucial and important.
Yeah, and we had a comment from Emily saying that they discussed different classes of inclusion, so race, gender, sex, ability, and other training that they've had. They talked about the advantages in life that people have that change their starting point.
Mm-hmm.
Another comment from Noah was, wow, they're coming in now. I was asked in my group about whether I volunteered or was voluntold to think about diversity, equity, inclusion. And I really liked how that made me consider both my personal commitment, which is strong, and my organization's commitment, which in his, their perception might be weak. And then questions, how to overcome denial, the resistance to accepting that people are marginalized in your organization. How do we communicate the ROI of this type of training to a non-diverse leadership group? I mean, lots of good stuff here. So I don't know if you want me to keep going or if you want to comment on any of that.
No, I'll comment on a couple things. One is that our individual commitment is incredibly important, and that we all will land in different organizational environments. And I've seen a lot of people feel like, I just need to convince them. How do I need to convince them that they're wrong? And if I got on here and said, I'm going to try and convince you that you're wrong, how open does your mind stay? And so one of the things that we're in, when we're in an environment where there's resistance and we're trying to push the work, we need to meet people where they are. So I can say, we need to do this work. You're over there, come over here with us so we can do this work. Or I can go over to where you are, listen to what's going on for you, and start from where you are. So I would say where there's resistance, there's a lot of listening to do, because people's perspective make complete sense when you get an insight to the sum total of their life experience. And so we need to demonstrate the skills, tools, and values of equity and inclusion. And a part of that is listening to one another. A part of that is being able to hold difference, that multiple truths can coexist even if they're conflicting. So am I willing to listen to where people are, or do I require that they come to where I am? The other thing that can be useful is to share where your own challenges are. So instead of telling someone they're wrong, I might say, I used to have a perspective similar to that, or tell them a story when I made a mistake. Like, I have a colleague who is transgender, and we were in a training with 60 people, and I referred to them as her in front of all these 60 people. And they said to me, them. And I didn't even catch that I had done it. And so rather than acting like, I've been doing this for 30 years, rather than acting like I'm perfect and I know everything, come forth with the challenges that I make every day and every week, and try and invite people to look at their challenges. So this isn't someone perfect who's coming to someone imperfect. We're on the journey together. So to the extent that we can take that approach, we meet people where they are, and we bring some humility about the struggles that we face.
Yeah. There's a lot of really good comments, you know, about, you know, a lot of people will say, well, you know, Portland and Oregon in general is not a very diverse city. So it's hard, you know, to have a diverse organization. And the comment was, you know, you can attract more diverse folks if you make an effort to do so and create an environment where those folks feel included, all people feel included. And there was some consensus around that. There were also a couple of comments that I think are important about recognizing that efforts can be healing or re-traumatizing. And as a person of color, equity work was very traumatizing when you know, a particular individual started learning about it. So I think having some awareness and sensitivity around that.
Yeah. One thing I would add is we all come to this work differently. All of us are privileged, and all of us are targeted by some kind of bias. And that, so I encourage people, one, to try and stop what's hurting you, and two, to come to the table willing to look at your own privilege. And so everyone has a piece of work to do in this. And there are some environments in which there's a lot of privilege and a lack of understanding about the impact that has, or an invalidation or belief that barriers exist and that power and privilege is attached to social identity. And then we have choices to make. Do I want to stay in that environment? Do I want to cut my losses? How much of my life and energy am I going to bring into an environment that's invalidating of me? So I think we have choices to make, and that there are some places, there are great things happening in this city around equity and inclusion. There are great organizations to be a part of, and there are organizations that have not begun the work and don't value the work. So all of that is true, and there's different strategies. Some strategies confront, some strategies partner and try and bring people along. There's a range of strategies. So there's not one right way to do it. There are many right ways. And what I encourage you to do is to find out what will work with you. And if you don't like or trust the environment that you're in, get out as quickly as you can. We each get to decide how much risk we're willing to take and how much courage we can muster in the moment. And Um, in my experience, the collective process is often not a healing process. That healing is something that we can take charge of ourselves. I have done thousands of hours over the last 40 years in looking at how I was impacted by racism. And I got to a point where I could notice that someone else's racism had nothing to do with me. For me, that was a major victory. It didn't eliminate racism in the environment, but it made it clear to me that someone else's racism had nothing to do with me. And how that system is structure is set up is to disempower everyone, disempower people who have advantage and disempower people who have disadvantage. So I encourage all of us to, in terms of healing, to find places in our lives where we consistently heal from the impact of oppression, both in ways that we've been taught that we're better than other people and less than other people, and show up in ways in which we can center in our power and take care of ourselves. So thank you for your comments. I'll look at them. I want to take a break. I may have to come back on the phone because my video may go in and out. I'm getting a message that says my internet connection is unstable. So if you lose me, I'll probably come back on the phone and the internet connection will come back in a moment. So with that, it's almost 9:45.
Mm-hmm.
The next section that we do is pretty intense. So I'm going to ask us to, so I want to take a 10-minute break. We'll come back for the next section, which is, let me get, the next session is capacity building, framework and organizational assessment. That'll be pretty intensive. So get a good break. Come back please be back ready to go at 5 minutes till 10. And then we'll take a quick stretch break as we go from that section to strategically investing your DEI resources. So get ready for sort of an hour plus of intensive engagement around this framework and organizational assessment. Thank you.
break.
We're going to reconvene in 1 minute. Susie, does it look like I should go on, or can you tell? If
Yeah, I think we could get started whenever you're ready.
Great. So welcome back. Just a couple comments that folks made from the discussion around diversity, equity, and inclusion concepts and definitions. One is we discussed how important our internal work is to be present and responsive to our teams and really engage in the journey with our communities. And I just want to, I appreciate that. I think that was some Angel, that this work is a journey. James Baldwin says the thing about a journey is you don't know where it will take you. You don't know what you will find when you get there, and you don't know how you will react to that. So in some ways, it's a leap of faith. And for those of us that like certainty, this journey can feel uncomfortable. And what we encourage you to do is to step into the discomfort and get in a process that you can trust. We're going to look, someone said, that it's not barriers in the organization that keep from attracting a diverse workforce. It's the business type. And one of the things we'll do as we look at the capacity building framework and organizational assessment is look at the systems in which we operate and the way those systems have been inclusive and exclusive, and that sometimes we need to address things at the systemic level. So if there is an industry that does not speak to people, there is a historical context to address for why that occurs, and that may be where folks need to start. And then the last one is someone has had experience with an intern and has learned a lot about diversity and unconscious bias and how it is to live with that. And I just encourage all of us to both have our own practice of internal development so that we can take those opportunities, learn from them, and really engage personally and not become over-reliant on other people. It's great to use observations that are present. I have heard so many people in the last 30 years say, well, how am I supposed to know that if they won't teach me? As if the only way we can learn about other cultural differences is for the people who hold those differences to be our teachers. In this age, you can Google anything and get tons of information. So there's no need to hold other people responsible for our education. That actually is one of the forms of privilege in which we expect to be taught and for other people to take responsibility for our own learning. So thanks for those comments. We're going to go on to this really important section of capacity building framework, which is really, if you have a mental model about how to build capacity around this work, great. See if there's anything to add to that. And if you don't, consider using this one. There is a lot of good work going on in the city around diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of, it's the perspectives are diverse. We certainly at Capacity Building Partnerships don't think we have all the answers. We think we know a lot, but there are a lot of different ways to think about this. We encourage you to get put a framework in your mind that identifies where you need to build capacity and where your organization needs to build capacity. And we're going to look at a little of that now. If you find this useful, please carry it away as a sort of a mental map, a mental mindset that helps you strategically advance your DEI development. And one last thing I'll say before we go to the slides is that I remember in the early 90s sort of stepping into multicultural conflict and not knowing how to handle it. And then I remember after about 5 years of work, some of it around multicultural conflict resolution, being in a multiracial conflict and feeling comfortable. And my point there is when we invest time in understanding ourselves, understanding other people, and gaining some skills, we end up showing up differently where these issues surface. So the good news is when we invest time, we just automatically end up showing up differently. Excuse me. So please take a look at this image on the screen. Notice what's in the center. These 3 competencies: increasing awareness and knowledge, taking action and changing behavior, and transforming systems so they result in diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are 3 key areas to invest in your capacity development. Increasing awareness and knowledge. What do you know? What do you not know? Everyone think of 2 or 3 cultural groups, cultural identity groups that you know very little about. It could be based on race and ethnicity, could be based on gender identity, sexual orientation, geographic origin, language difference, immigrant status, religious differences, physical and mental differences and abilities, age. Just think about a group in which you lack awareness and knowledge about their cultural orientation, their cultural framework, their lived experience. That's a group, and then think about if there's one of those groups that relate to doing your job. So it can be really fun to learn a new and different culture. And increasing awareness and knowledge is really rooted in culture. We all have a culture, and that culture informs what we see and what we don't see. So that your cultural orientation gives you a lens. 2 people, 3 people, 4 people experience the same thing and all have a different narrative and story about what happened. Is someone lying? No. They're viewing it through their own cultural lens. Someone thought this was great. Someone thought this was awful. Someone is confused about what happened. The cultural lens through which we view the world allows us to see different things. That's one of the reasons diverse environments bring so much more data into that help us to make better decisions. So increasing awareness and knowledge is key. It's not enough. We need to take action and change behavior. A lot of work happens at this increasing awareness and knowledge point. And oftentimes it doesn't lead to doing something different. It is not enough. It's important to increase awareness and knowledge, but it's not enough. We need to take action and change behavior. We need to be more inclusive, listen better, ask more questions, change policies that are discriminatory or exclusive, deal with cultural dynamics that happen in our team meeting. Who always speaks, who never speaks, who is assumed to be smart, who is assumed not to be smart. Tons of things that we can do. Where do we have unconscious bias? How do we monitor and challenge ourselves where we have unconscious bias? Tons of things to do. And so a lot of work happens around increasing awareness and knowledge, some around taking action and changing behavior. Often very little happens at the transforming systems, so they result in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if we don't change systems, as soon as you're gone, the system moves in and maintains what was happening. Because systems try and maintain stasis. If you poke a system here, it moves over there to maintain the same outcome. Systems are perfectly designed for the outcomes that they achieve. So we see inequities and we think there's something wrong, when actually that's how the system was designed. So if we don't change the system, it will continue to produce inequitable outcomes. So these are 3 competencies that we can develop over a lifetime. This is not 1 month, 1 week, 1 year. This is the work of a lifetime. And so I'd like you to think about how you individually and how you organizationally build your capacity. And this capacity in these 3 areas increases your effectiveness, helps you to be a better steward to achieve your mission, whether it's making more money or helping children in abusive situations or foster care. So, so think about, this is the core of our framework, these 3 competencies. Around them are 3 views or levels. We do the work as individuals. What is your individual program? Regardless of what's going on organizationally, what is your individual program to increase your capacity? The more people in your organization that take on individual development, then all of a sudden you're in a meeting and you're talking differently, and people are being more inclusive and noticing how to include people who may not be included. Maybe you're reaching out to a more diverse range of vendors. Maybe you're noticing where your services or your products aren't landing. I was working with an insurance company on the East Coast, and they were sort of lukewarm to diversity and inclusion is how they framed it. And when they realized that that their market was changing, and that in a few years, if they did not increase their capacity to reach out to the Latino community, to the Latinx community, their business was going to slowly dry up. And then they really got on board. So, but as individuals, what needs to happen, and then what needs to happen in groups, teams, and organizations. So we need to work at, we need to work at this level as well. And then within institutions and structures of society. The person who mentioned we can't attract people to our industry. So what is the history of that industry that made it unattractive to some identity group of people? What is it? And how do you address that in order to be more open and inclusive? So this is the implementation diagram. So as individuals, you have an ongoing plan for this. In your organization, at the team level, at a group identity level, you have a plan for this. And then you're looking at systems and structures that impact the environment that you're in. If you don't look at institutions and structures of society, then your progress will be short-lived. And we can help those institutions become more inclusive by participating in them and by challenging them, by supporting them, by creating a common vision within them that operates differently. So this is the work at these 3 levels. And you can see there's 1, 2, 3, there's 1, 2, 3. When you put that in a matrix, you get 9 areas for development. And I'm going to ask you to do an organizational assessment on that in a moment. In a minute, I'm going to go through just a short review of each of these competencies and some of the skills associated with that. Before I go there, I'd like you to, if you're taking notes, take a moment to jot down some notes. And if there's anything that you want to raise in the larger group, please type a question into the chat or a comment. I can't remember if I mentioned you will receive a copy of this recording, and we will send you a PDF of the slides later today.
Yes.
Okay. So keep in mind this visual of these 3 levels. You know, these are basically levels of system: the individual level, the group level, and the institutional level. And how we're building competency at each of those levels around these 3 competencies. And that a part of the assessment is finding out where you have capacity and where you lack capacity. And then you can strategically target where you lack capacity. And
There are a couple of good comments, I think, Cliff.
great.
Yeah, so one was, it's interesting to think about the direction of the arrows.
Mm-hmm.
We often start with awareness and knowledge, but maybe changing actions and behaviors can lead to deeper awareness and knowledge for some individuals. What are your thoughts on that?
I really appreciate that comment because I think it's really true. The increasing awareness and knowledge is often very conceptual. And for many of us, it's give me something to do. What do I do? People are wanting to know what I do. And if I say, no, we need to do increasing awareness first, I lose people. So I want you to think about what are things that you can do, because many people learn by doing. So thank you for catching that. These arrows indicate that you can start anywhere and that it is an ongoing process and cycle. Thank you for mentioning that. I think that was Whitney.
Yes. And Stephanie had said earlier that she had a colleague who shared with her that it's important for organizations to build trust within diverse communities over time. Mm-hmm. So that's showing up to events, being visible, showing support, being open to learning, be vulnerable about what you don't know, and to your point, acknowledge privilege. So it's kind of like when you think about building trust mm-hmm. and connection, it doesn't just happen automatically. You know, you have to show through consistent behavior and commitment, right, that you have a vested interest.
Yeah, great point. So don't walk out the door and say, okay, I'm going to go find someone and see how we can work together. For many marginalized, targeted communities, it's a revolving door of people wanting to come in and know how to work. And often it's transactional. And many of those communities are relational. The way you build partnership is you show up over time. One organization that I saw do this was Basic Rights Oregon. In the early 90s, they were really focused on some of the anti-gay initiatives and tried to build coalitions based on their self-interest. Through the 90s, in the early 2000s, I saw them start to show up at rallies, start to back initiatives for for people of color, for people with disabilities, and that they, over time, really built a powerful coalition. Not by going in and saying, can you help us with our issue, but showing up at rallies. I know at some of the protests around police violence against African Americans, they showed up in mass to marches and rallies, and that built a huge amount of connection and trust. So whatever industry, you may not be operating in the social justice field, but wherever you're operating, look for opportunities to build relationships and connection. And over time, those relationships are likely to offer new trusted opportunities. A colleague of mine a couple days ago was saying, white male health provider going into an African American church, and really understood that he needed to listen and not go in with an ask, and really need to notice cultural behavior, and actually was able to, someone wanted to hug him, and he said, I would love to hug you, but I'm concerned about your safety and my safety. And hugging could put both of us at greater risk. So I'm going to defer that for a later date. And the person actually thanked him, said, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way before. So tons of ways that we can show up open and authentic and build connection and relationship.
Cliff, there's
yeah.
a question here. It says, how do you get an organization that is stuck in increased awareness and knowledge to move towards the center or the other core competencies?
Yeah, and so I think it is, one thing I do is I have a matrix that I'll show you in a moment that has the intersection of these points of view and the competencies. And you might map where your organization is and suggest to people ways that you might move into action.
Mm-hmm.
And so a good way to move people out of sort of really focusing internally on building capacity into doing something is to look for the low-hanging fruit and make a suggestion. And maybe you have to make 10 suggestions. And part of it is, what is the barrier for moving from awareness to action? Is it fear? Is it, what is it? What is the barrier? And so one of the ways you move people forward is by identifying what the barriers are and then identifying strategies to reduce them. If it's fear, then maybe we agree on a level of risk that we're willing to take, and we'll try it for 6 months and then revisit it. That we won't jump in so fully that if we experience risk beyond what we're comfortable with, that we're stuck. That's just, it's really what is the real lived experience of the barriers that's keeping people from moving forward. And someone is saying diversity is more than race. It is. And there's some interesting, so my intent is not to suggest that diversity is just race. That's why I used examples that included gender, sexual orientation, ability, religion, age, immigrant status, geographical origin. Those are all areas of diversity and difference, and areas in which there is unconscious and conscious bias that impacts people from and excludes people. So I think it's very important to commit to focusing on a broad range of differences. For some organizations, it's useful to center something that is strategic. It could be race, it could be gender, it could be sexual orientation. It's useful to center something because really to center the things that are most challenging. What we often see, particularly in Portland and Oregon, is that people will focus on anything but race. So in those situations for organizations, it's often useful to center race and include it with the intent of focusing on all forms of bias and oppression. But center race because if we don't center it, we won't deal with it. And there's historical reasons, you know, if I encourage you to Google the Bacon Rebellion, in which we have a 350-year history of people of color and white people being separated. That white people for 350 years, particularly poor and working class white people, have been encouraged to see their interests as with more wealthy white people than with people of color. And so because those two groups, poor and working class people of color and white people, have an incredible amount of power. When they're separated, each group has less power. So there is a long history in the institutions of our society in separating those groups. So centering so racial separation and disparities in some ways is built into the DNA of our country and the exploitation that's attached to that. So there are many analysis about why we center race. None of them should exclude or limit our work around equity and inclusion to race. I think race, there's someone that says, please define race and ethnicity. I will, ethnicity is cultural identity. So if I take Latinx folks, some people have strong Spanish heritage. Some people from Latin America have very diverse cultural traditions in Panama, in Peru, in all different parts of Mexico. Some people are more connected with indigenous identity. So ethnicity are sort of the variations within a racial group. Race is constructed, it's not genetic. So I'll just quickly say, race was constructed really to take the lands of people of color. In Europe, the land went to the eldest son. So the second sons down had no land. What is landed gentry without land? So that was a part of the reason for the exploration around the world was more land. And a part of the rationale for taking that land was racial identification of people as subhuman. So the construction of race is very related to the exploration of the New World from Europe. And so race is really a cultural construct, not a genetic construct. Scientifically, people within a racial group are more diverse than people across racial groups. So people are not genetically identical within racial groups, but culturally, people develop an orientation that reflects the cultural value oftentimes of that group. So there's tons of research and explanations about that. So it's useful as you look at culture to gain a deeper understanding that race and ethnicity is primarily culturally, it's learned culture. And learned culture is incredibly powerful, but it's not inherent. And that's really important. Culture is not inherent, it's learned behavior. And what's important about that is when we stereotype people, we're often assuming that trait, often a negative trait or behavior, sometimes a positive one, is attached to their identity as their racial, gender, sexual orientation identity, that is inherent. And the explanation for that is that people who behave in common, who have a common lived experience, often behave in common ways. So you can teach a group that they're not smart, and then you run into 10 people from that group who have cognitive challenges, and it just shows the power of culture and cultural narrative. So I actually did mention, someone said I haven't mentioned physical differences as a diverse group. I actually did. I'm not sure if you were on the call when I did that. You know, the Americans with Disability movement was an incredible struggle against the oppression of people with disabilities, and really a historic victory that transformed everything. And one of the things I learned from that movement is that when we are inclusive, much of what we get through inclusion benefits people beyond the group for whom it was intended. That when we, excuse me, adopt more inclusive behaviors, lots of people benefit. When we look at accessibility, many people benefit from that beyond people with disability. So I want to go really briefly, I'm just checking time, to the competencies. And what I'd like you to do, you'll get this in a slide, but just think about these competencies. Increasing awareness and knowledge, it's really rooted in culture and understanding cultural differences. The more our identities are rooted in dominant culture, the less we have to even notice that we have a culture. When we began doing this work in the 90s, we would go into a room of 75 people and say, who has a culture? And generally only the people of color would raise their hand. By the end of the 90s, we would ask that question and almost everyone in the room would raise their hand. And there was a burgeoning awareness in this region and throughout the country that everyone has a culture. It's incredibly important to know what your culture is and who you are. We had a judge assign a skinhead to take our diversity training series because he was starting to enter into the realm of hate crimes towards other people. We had some homework once that was, we were meeting for 3 weeks in a row, and we said, your homework is to investigate your cultural heritage. He came back the next week and said, I'm half Native American, and I didn't even know it. And what he said to us is, I didn't know who I was, and the skinhead culture provided belonging for me. I was looking for belonging. He didn't say it in those words, but as he described his experience, that is what it was. And he is half Native American, and he's starting to participate in white supremacist behavior. So connection with our own cultural identity helps us a lot. I would say it's hard to do this work effectively and authentically if you are not connected with our multicultural identities. All of us are intersections of many cultural identities. And usually 1 or 2 or 3 of them dominate our worldview. You know, I'm many things, I hold many cultural identities, but the one that really, that the lens through which I see the world is really as a Black person, because that has had a huge impact on my experience. So increasing awareness and knowledge is both about culture, cultural differences, cultural identity, and cultural intelligence. Cultural intelligence is the skill of being able to learn, understand different cultures. Some of us freeze up when we move out of our cultural comfort zone. Some of us move very freely and are very comfortable in cultures in which we're not familiar. So increasing our cultural intelligence, picking up the cues, understanding the values, understanding the differences, being comfortable engaging across cultural differences increases our capacity to create inclusive and welcoming environments. And it also gives us a lot of data about how someone may, about different needs that someone may need to bring to our products, services, and organizations. Some of the skills, please take a look at these skills. You'll get this in a PDF of the PowerPoint, but all of this, there's 30 skills there. Exploring culture, exploring bias, examining stereotypes, understanding microaggressions, cross-cultural interactions, identifying intent and impact, an incredibly important skill. I may have said something that was offensive or hurtful, and that wasn't my intent. If that wasn't my intent, I'm likely to defend my intent instead of look at the impact it had. So understanding intent versus impact and not over focusing on, I didn't mean that, and focusing on what is the impact that had on you. Accumulated unhealed painful emotions, looking at privilege. There are many privilege checklists. It's really helpful. C through G are some of the privilege checklists that exist. Listening is a really powerful skill. Listening to understand versus listening to reply, and developing listening partnerships. So when you're looking at skills to develop that help you increase your awareness and knowledge, here's the list that you'll get that you can look through. Taking action and changing behavior. It's, someone mentioned you're stuck in increasing awareness and knowledge. So the new information that we get from that is often not sufficient is hardly ever sufficient to change our behavior. We actually have to do something. I'm a child of the 60s. In the late 60s, early 70s, we thought by about the mid to late 70s, we would have all this fixed and we'd be sipping pina coladas at the beach. And what we discovered was the massive influx of information about disparities that happened in the 60s and 70s was not sufficient to change systems. That there was a temporary adjustment, but it quickly reverted back to the bias, the disparate outcomes that had existed before. So that information is not enough to change behavior. We need to strategize behavior change. And if people are resistant, we need to meet them where they are. In some situations, we need to move them out of the way without recreating an oppressive system. Oftentimes, I see folks wanting to say, well, I know the right way, so people need to do what I think is right. And that is simply recreating an oppressive system with us in charge. That does not mean anything goes, but it does for me mean that we don't use invalidation as a strategy to shut people down. Something that comes to mind for me is I had a colleague once who said, I'm going to tell a sexist joke. He announced to this group of me and a mixed group of men and women, and I said, you can't tell the joke. And he said, I told it to 3 women and they thought it was funny, and I said, you can't tell the joke. And he said, I'm getting ready to tell it. I said, you can't tell the joke. And I just held that line. So I didn't say, you're a stupid, sexist, chauvinist pig. I didn't berate him. I didn't put him down. I didn't invalidate him. I just said, you can't tell the joke. And as long as I maintained that stance, even if he had told it, it wouldn't have been funny. So it's really important not to recreate the mechanisms of bias, exclusion, and oppression as we try and create more inclusive and equitable environments. How do we not invalidate people? And it doesn't mean we have to put up with standards, behaviors, and values that are discriminatory or biased or oppressive. But it does mean that in doing that, we don't mimic the structures of oppression to stop people for whom we disagree. Some of the skills related to taking action and changing behavior: learn a new culture, identify a new culture that you want to learn. Identify a group that you want to increase awareness of. This concept of voluntary displacement is putting yourself in a cultural situation in which you're unfamiliar and observing. Tracking is a great skill. Tracking is a skill of noticing non-inclusive behavior. Like you might say, I'm noticing that English speakers in this meeting have talked 3 times, and some folks for whom English is their first language, and folks for whom it's not, many have not spoken once. And I don't say, and we English speakers need to shut up and let other people speak. I just state, I track my observation, and I in a neutral way, share that with the group. Interrupting bias, incredibly important. Interrupting bias in ways that build connection and not clobber people and shut them down. Creating a feedback-rich environment. Difficult conversations. Really important. A lot of this work happens through difficult conversations. And difficult conversation is a skill set. It's an emotional state, but it's also a skill set. So several things that you can do to take action. And then this last one, transforming systems so they result in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Central to achieving diversity, equity, and inclusion is systems change. And so, again, understanding how systems operate, understanding how systems privilege some and disadvantage others, understand how systems are successful. When we have disparate outcomes, it's not because the system isn't successful, it's because the system is designed to create disparate outcomes. So we must then design systems that create equitable outcomes. So this is critically important work. Here are some of the skills related to this. Anti-racist checklist or anti-oppressive checklist. It could be an anti-sexist checklist, or it could be an anti-bias, anti-prejudice checklist for people with disabilities. Understanding how systems of privilege operate. Understanding intersectionality, the ways that our identities overlap. Fundamental attribution error. That means when we don't look at the root cause of systemic issues, and we keep trying things, but we don't understand how to do root cause analysis. Let's see, where would you get, so if you're looking at some of the privilege checklists, just Google privilege checklist and they'll come up. We have them. We have an equity manual that we use in our capacity development cohort that has all of this material in it. Oh, my audio is shaky.
Now it seems better. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for letting me know. Verbally let me know if it's not, if it gets shaky again, I can get on the phone. So there's a lot to do, right? And then I just can look at this later, but it's also useful to think about as individuals, groups, teams, and organizations, and within institutions and structures of society. What does the work look like from that point of view? So I want to stop there and see if there are any comments or questions. Reactions. I know that's a lot of information.
Yeah, I think the conversation skills are hard enough to learn on, just any kind of conversation. So any recommendations you have for reading or training that help with building those conversational skills, especially on this topic, would be helpful.
So we'll include some of that in the PDF. So earlier I said the intersections of the 3 competencies and the 3 identities create 9 areas. And I'd like you, I'm going to turn to that slide. There's a lot there. I'm going to highlight it because it's hard to read. But mostly I'd like you to be thinking about, are these areas for your development or for your organization's development? Where do you feel like, oh, I've done a lot of that work, and where do you feel like this is new to me? And actually, I think I'll go a couple slides ahead. So I'm going to ask you, as I'm going through, would you please write down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, either on a piece of paper, or if you have another screen you can type on. And as I go through these 9 areas, I'd like you to evaluate yourself or your organization and with minuses and pluses. You can see at the bottom of the screen, there are 6 ratings. Either 3 negatives means we haven't even thought about this, maybe I didn't even know that existed. And the plus, plus, plus at the other end means I know this, I've been doing this, I'm aware of this, I'm on that journey. And the ratings are anywhere in between. And this is to help you self-assess your organization or yourself. And the intent of the self-assessment is for you to be able to strategically identify a place to focus for development. One of the challenges is you can't do all this at once. It's impossible, even if you make it your full-time job. So what are the low-hanging fruit? What is strategic for you? What's strategic for your organization? That's what I'd like you to start thinking about. The 9 areas are, 1 is increasing awareness as an individual, 2 is increasing awareness and knowledge in groups, teams, and organizations, 3 is increasing awareness and knowledge within institutions and structures of society. And the same for taking action. 4 is as an individual, 5 is taking action in groups, teams, and organizations, 6 is within institutions and structures of society. So these 9 areas are places where you can strategize your development and do work. Okay? So I'm going to briefly review them. While I do that, I'd like you to, for each area, give yourself a rating. Don't sweat over it. You know, your first thought is often the most useful. What I want you to do is to walk away with some data about where you have strengths and where you could invest in building capacity. So I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly. Let me see. So one is the intersection of increasing awareness and knowledge as an individual. Take a look at that and rate yourself. I increased my awareness of culture, my culture, cultural identity, cultural differences, and cultural intelligence, and the ways advantage and disadvantage relate to cultural identity. So either I never do that, I didn't know that existed, I've been doing that every day, or somewhere in between. Number two, we notice the impact of culture and cultural differences on how we engage one another. We become more aware of ways group identity membership impacts groups, teams, and organizations, and provides or denies access and voice. So this is increasing awareness in groups, teams, and organizations. Number three is increasing awareness within the structures and institutions of society. We learn about the history of bias and conferring privilege in societal institutions and structures within which our industries operate. So the person who said people aren't attracted to our industry, this is where you look at the history of why that is. Because equity is when social identity do not determine outcomes. So we would expect in any group, some people will be successful and some people will not. But when that is tracked by social identity group, then there's bias. So we expect a range within groups, but we don't expect we don't expect an industry to be unattractive to a social identity group. So there is a history there that has created that, and the impact of that history on people and norms within our industries. So that's increasing awareness and knowledge. Now let's look. So I'm wanting you to be doing ratings. You should have ratings for 1, 2, and 3. Now we're going to go to 4, 5, and 6. 4 is this is taking action and changing behavior as individuals. I apply my increased awareness and cultural intelligence to intentionally learning and applying new skills and strategies to interrupt bias and interject equity and inclusion around me. So if this is something that you do or don't do, rate yourself appropriately. Taking action and changing behavior. Number 5, at the group, team, organizational level, we apply our increased awareness and do things to address exclusion and inequity, including adopting new mindsets, listening across differences, engaging in difficult conversations, leaning into discomfort, and crafting shared visions for equity. A lot of groups work at this level. Taking action at the group, team, and organizational level. This is where many, many groups find the area in which they need to work. Number 6 is we apply our increased awareness and knowledge. This is taking action within institutions and structures of society. We apply our increased awareness and knowledge in challenging dominant cultural narratives and institutions and structures of society that privilege and disadvantage on the basis of how people are situated with regards to cultural and social identity group membership. That means we're really looking at the dominant cultural narratives that include or exclude in institutions and structures of society. And then finally, transforming systems. Transforming systems at the individual level. As an individual, I learn about how identity-based advantage and disadvantage are systemic and ways that I am directly impacted by those systems. How are you impacted by, how are you privileged or disadvantaged by the systems and structures in society? That awareness is really critical in in working to transform them. Transforming institutions and structures. This is at the group level. We identify and change bias and inequitable organizational policies, practices, and procedures, the systems and institutions they are a part of, and the intended and unintended disparate outcomes they create. Again, another place that folks often work at the organizational level is looking at inequitable organizational policies, practices, and procedures. And then finally, 9 is transforming systems. And this is within the institutions and structures of society. We cultivate and apply long-term strategies for integrating or increasing DEI inclusion capacity and increasing understanding of how systems operate, and change in creating systems that result in DEI. What is you and your organization's long-term commitment to systemic change? So that was a lot. So I am hoping that you ended up with some numbers like this that give you some assessment of yourself and your organization's DEI journey. And again, these numbers correlate to these boxes. So I'm going to shift to 2 things, and then we're going to go back in breakout rooms for you to share sort of what's rolling around in your mind, what's clear, what's not clear. But this next piece is around your diversity, equity, and inclusion vision. And I'm going to ask you to take a couple minutes and write down a vision. If you already have one, great, write it down and evaluate it. If you don't have one, I want you to just start developing one, because it's critical to have a vision. What is the world you're trying to create, organizationally or broader? What I see a lot in organizations is they jump into this work and they don't have a vision of what they're trying to do. And you can do a lot of great work for a year or 2 or 3, but invariably people will look up and say, what are we doing and why are we doing it? And your vision guides your strategy. There are thousands and thousands of things that you could do. So those 9 areas of focus and your vision help you identify your next steps. So I'll give you some examples of vision. Eliminating barriers, enhancing opportunities. That's a vision statement that a group came up with. Our commitment to inclusion across race, gender, age, religion, identity, and experiences drives us forward every day. That's a vision. Diversity, inclusion, they're more than just words for us. They're hard and fast principles guiding how we build our teams, cultivate leaders, and create a company that's the right fit for every person inside of it. We have a global, multicultural following. We want to reflect that inside our walls. Another powerful vision statement. We promote an inclusive environment that maximizes the individual and organizational opportunity, potential, and responsibility of its members, volunteer leaders, staff, and other stakeholders. So what is the world that you want within your organization? So I'd like you to take, I'll give you 1 minute to think about that. And then I'm gonna come back, we'll come back and we'll move into small groups.
Cliff, to clarify, is this similar to the organization's diversity statement or their equity statement?
It could be.
Okay.
It depends on how it's been constructed. And I think it's up to you whether you write an individual vision statement or organization. And so it may be your equity statement. If it's your equity statement, write that down and see if it points you in a direction. Sometimes those are written externally, internally, or to document what exists. So they are written in very different ways. What I want you to do is to identify the world that you want.
Mm-hmm.
So this should not be what exists now. This
Okay.
should be your aspiration. And of course, I don't expect you to come up with a completed vision statement now. Just like you may just jot down some words. Anything that will help you focus your mind and organize your mind around what you're trying to achieve. That's the intent here. So I'd like you to take whatever you've been able to put together. You may have one that's pretty clear, or you may just be beginning to think of it. Wherever you are is fine. I'm going to ask you to go back in small discussion groups. We'll do it until 10 after 11. And these are the questions. Please jot them down. So you've done that assessment. What's the gap between your vision and your current reality? And what has been most useful to you regarding the framework and organizational assessment? And sort of, what would be helpful to do next? So what's the gap between your vision and your current reality? The benefit there is it gives you some very specific things to move towards. And what's been useful around this, and what do you want to follow up on? And you're free to talk about how it hasn't been useful. I'm assuming this doesn't work for everyone. So, one thing my colleague Guadalupe Guajardo says, do it how you can do it, not how you can't. So if there are parts of this that don't work for you, don't do them. If you can find something that's useful and will work for you, work there. Any questions before we move into these small groups? Again, you'll be put in random small groups of 3 people. Please make sure someone track time. You're going to come back at 10 after 11. So please make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. So Susie, could you put them in groups now?
I will. Here you go. Some groups have 2, some groups have 3. So, and I kept it fairly consistent so you can reconnect with some of the same folks you talked with earlier. Okay.
All right.
Okay, I'm closing the rooms.
Didn't mind him this much this time. Okay.
All right, welcome back. Are most folks back? Susie?
I think so. Yeah, people are coming back. It's interesting what the technology does when you go back and forth into these rooms. So we had a couple people who couldn't get into their room, or they just had video and no audio. And then I noticed when we came back, I could see everyone for a minute. So I think there's just, depending on folks' connectivity, there is a little bit of clunkiness with the groups. But
Alright.
hopefully the bulk of folks were able to participate.
Yeah. So if you weren't able to participate, we apologize. We're struggling a bit with the technology, but generally I think it's going well. But we apologize if you weren't able to participate. And do you see the screen that says DEI Vision, DEI Frameworks and Mindsets?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So just in wrapping that up, this is the integrate of the DEI frameworks and mindsets. Like, can you hold those in your mind as you think about and your organizational assessment and your vision, and focus on the gap between what you want and where you are, and identify next steps that will get you there. So we are coming to closing, and actually as we move to closing, I'd like you to I'm not exactly sure where my controls are. We'll see if this changes them. All right. So next step, strategically investing your DEI time, energy, and resources. I'd like you to think about your next steps, and I'd like you to wrap up with next steps. Here are some possible ones. You could select one of these, or you might construct another one. Focusing on recruitment, hiring, and retention. Those systems are usually saturated with bias, both around standards, both around the stereotypes that we bring, both around creating a welcoming environment. Unconscious bias is rife in recruiting, hiring, and retention. And we do sort of micro advantage or micro aggressions create an inclusive and welcoming environment or environment that's unwelcoming. And I think I'm being incredibly welcoming and someone is experiencing me as unwelcoming. And I don't even know what I'm doing. That I have unconscious bias going on in terms of how I engage with people. 2, creating and maintaining a welcoming and inclusive environment. Tons of things to do there. Equitable and inclusive policies is a place where you might look. Inclusive and equitable teams working at the team level. Greater diversity at the leadership, management, and or executive levels. Many organizations have diversity at the front lines and not diversity at where most of the power is centered. 6, engage in difficult conversations about bias and address cross-cultural conflict. A great area for building capacity. DEI, that should be driving DEI in management structures and systems. So how do we drive diversity and equity and inclusion in how we operate the organization? Mobilizing the organization around a shared DEI vision and future, and setting shared goals, targets, aspirations. Some of what I was asking you to do around the vision is that needs to be shared and held. Effectively developing and using an equity lens, having a DEI policy audit, identifying our business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So don't do it because it's the right thing to do, but do it because it's in the interest of our mission and vision. That's one way to move people who don't see why to do it. What is the analysis of why this would be effective in your organization, in your industry, in your business? Setting up DEI evaluation measures, indicators, data collection, and or evaluation systems. So how do we measure this? How do we build in accountability? How do we set standards? One of the things I often say that I haven't said this morning is this isn't about changing people's belief systems. It's changing their behavior. At work, it's not our job to change what people believe. But at work, it is to set behavioral standards that reflect the values of equity and inclusion. So people can believe whatever they believe, as long as when you show up to the job, you can behave in ways that reflect our values for diversity, equity, and inclusion. But that means we have to develop those behavioral standards. That could be another next step. And then 13 is ongoing development of employee DEI skills and capacity. So how are we building our workforce's skills and capacity? We can set aspirations, but if we don't support them, then why would we expect that we would get there? You may come up with others. I'd like you to identify a possible next step of you and your organization's DEI journey, and or how might you use the next step to engage your team to build new DEI skills and capacity. So basically, out of this, sort of where do you want to focus? And I'm going to ask you, we're going to close in small groups. We're going to do some, I'm going to give you a minute to think about this. And then we're going to go to see if you have any remaining questions. So take a moment and write down your next step. We're gonna, when we close, Susie will put us in small groups. And then when you're done with those small groups, you'll be able to leave the meeting. But before we do that, I just wanna see if there are more questions. So I'll give you a minute to complete this.
Cliff, do you recommend picking, maybe starting with one or two at most at a time? Maybe one at a time?
For what?
Like if I'm looking at these next steps, it
Mhm.
can be very overwhelming
Yeah.
and knowing where to start. So would you suggest, you know, once I kind of have my idea around my vision and maybe our greatest opportunities, would I maybe just pick one of these to focus on at
Yeah.
a time?
I would say just one of these. Any of these alone you could work on for a long time.
Right.
So what's the low-hanging fruit that will motivate people? If you're in an organization in which people need to do something, what are one of these that would provide activity that will bring us up against our challenges? And then we can focus on those challenges because we're creating a more inclusive recruiting, hiring, and retention process. So work on any of these will bring you up against your organizational challenges. But the work then is in the context of something that you're doing, not because you're trying to fix somebody. Thanks for that question. So I'm going to open it up for questions. So we have about 5 minutes, 5 to 6 minutes. And then after that, we'll put you in pairs to share your next steps, and then you can be on with the rest of your day. So any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
So I feel like there's so much I want to do, and that's something about the vision breakout that we had. I said, my vision is we transform the world and everyone's listening to each other and we're all better at everything. And there's like kind of a big vision, but so how do you narrow it down and think about your own positional authority and power, and then use that information as well as the sort of like gap analysis to determine not only what is the next step or steps, but who do you enroll in accomplishing those, and then how much is the right amount to take on so you don't kill yourself trying to do too much, or what's too little that doesn't give it the right importance in the conversation, or it comes across as it's not as important because we're only going to start with this one little thing rather than this bigger thing. So I guess sort of framing it, was there a scaffolding or a framework or some sort of a swim lanes and staging or overall strategic plan? Maybe that's a big question.
It is a big question, but it's a great question. And I would say find 2 or 3 people. You know, I don't know what your role is organizationally, but find 2 or 3 people and ask those questions. So you had like 5 or 6 questions there. Those were great questions. And in this work, oftentimes it's more the questions than the answers. It's like asking the right question. So someone asked if you can share this within your organization and coworkers. Yes, you're welcome to share it. We want it to be used. Please keep Capacity Building Partnerships logo on it. And you'll get contact information for us when we send information out, but please do share it with other people. And so maybe you do that gap analysis, or maybe you, with those 2 or 3 other people, you look at those 9 boxes and say, this is where we're strong, and this is where we have some growth to do. And maybe you pick 2 things. What is one thing we could do that comes out of our strength, so that we can advance that and use what we know to be successful and to advance the work? And what's one area we might work that would make us more effective? So maybe you have 2 next steps, one that's strength-based and one that's capacity building. But you know, get with 3 or 4 people, look at that grid, think about that analysis, and then try something. Use a quick feedback loop. So bring organizational learning into this. So try it for 30 days, 2 months, 3 months, and then come back and evaluate how it's going. And if it looks like it was the wrong choice, say, we're going to do something else. Don't keep doing something that's not working.
I like that you said come from our strength. I think that's a great way to maybe start it in like a quick win context, considering the giving people the confidence that it's aligned with us and it's not going to be that hard. Or anyway, thanks.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question. Is there one more question?
There was a question about using task forces to do some of this work, breaking it down.
Yeah, I think it's useful to use equity groups or task forces. The advantage is that you often get a cross-section of the organization. You often get people that are interested in. The disadvantage is that can be disconnected from the management structure of the organization. What classically happens is you get an equity team. They don't have power to move the issue, but they're tasked with moving the issue. They end up taking on stuff they don't have the power to do. The management structure is not heavily engaged. One of the challenges you might encounter is if I'm a supervisor or leader in the organization, and this is not my area of expertise, and I'm used to being a subject matter expert, I don't touch this because I don't want to be viewed as someone who's not an expert. And so it's useful at the management team level, one, to charge them that they need to lead this within their teams. It doesn't just come from the equity team. And to ask them to get comfortable in learning with their team. If they're not a subject matter expert, don't pretend to be one. Be willing to say, we're going to figure this out together. I'm going to make some mistakes. I assume you're going to make some mistakes, and we're going to figure it out together. So it's really helpful to ask managers to step into a learning organization mode and move this work within their teams. So if you have, I appreciate people are sharing resources. If you have other questions, please feel free to include them and we'll try and get back to you on them. So Susie, I'm gonna now tell you goodbye and ask you to, before you leave this meeting, share with one other person what your next step is. Okay, that's really important for all of us. You know, the way we do this is everyone can do something, but not but you can't do everything. No one can do everything, but everyone can do something. So what is the thing that you can do? And I'd like you to speak that to someone because it reinforces getting that done. So thank you. I've enjoyed our time together. I'm sorry that I didn't get to interact more directly with you, but I appreciated your questions and my perception of your level of engagement. I'm with you. I'm on the journey too. I'm learning too. So I hope that our paths cross again. So with that, Susie, would you put them in pairs, share your next step, and then say goodbye. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you, Clifford.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And I switched the rooms around because we lost some people. So feel free to engage as you wish, and just know that you can exit when you're done, and we will send out the slides as well as the recording via email to all participants. So thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.